Hey everyone, Leo is here, not a Jumpstart Lightning episode. I have my friend Dima with me to talk to me about Azure Device Registry. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, Leo is here, not a Jumpstart Lightning episode. I have Dima here with me. Dima, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Lior.
Dima, we've been trying to get this on the books for a while because I really wanted to talk to you about Azure Device Registry. Before we starting to nerd out on all this stuff, who you are, what is it that you do?
Yeah, so my name is Dima Tokar, and I'm a product manager on the Azure Edge and Platform team working on Azure Device Registry.
Dima, we've been doing this Azure IoT operations video series for a while. We had few episodes, and one of those areas that keeps popping out of this video series is the notion of assets, right? And I've been talking about this for multiple times, and the fact that now you can have assets, basically, I'll call it things, just to keep it a bit more mystery for the sake of this session, of this recording, and you can see those popping in the Azure portal, which to me is just mind-blowing, the fact that you can do that. And I know that you also have some cool stuff to show me today. So Dima, talk to me. What Azure Device Registry is all about?
Yeah, thanks, Lior. So yeah, let me tell you all about it. So I think Azure Device Registry is a really cool service because it really kind of bridges together the worlds of the edge and the cloud in these
Mm,
industrial environments. And so one thing that I like to start with is just to level set with our viewers that one thing that makes it really challenging about the industrial environment is you have the OT and you have the IT persona that are all trying to run a business. And you have got the site IT and site OT, and you've got the enterprise IT and enterprise OT. And so
mm,
one of the things that ADR is really trying to solve for is to create a more convergence and more harmony between the various groups in the business. And so to that end, where I'd like to sort of start is to just show you where ADR is in this big diagram that you've probably seen in other episodes, and then to really kind of double click and talk to you specifically about the role that ADR plays. So if you see
mhm,
this diagram, you've got Azure IT operations front and center here, and this is the edge on the running on Kubernetes. And then on the right, you see Azure IT operations experience, and you have Azure Device Registry. So
mhm,
the role that Azure Device Registry plays is it is a key conduit for enabling a cloud management experience for the assets that you see popping up all over the cloud as well as the edge side. And so if we go to the next slide, we are zooming in on the Azure Device Registry architecture. And I'll just walk you through that before we dive in and talk a little bit more about kind of what ADR is really trying to accomplish. And so where we start with ADR is you have the OT operations team that's looking to manage their assets from the cloud. And so on the right-hand side of the diagram, you see that they're able to both manage the endpoint profile, which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as the asset that you've mentioned earlier. And so what ADR does here is it bridges the world of Azure Resource Manager, so the way that resources are exposed in the cloud, with
mhm,
the Kubernetes native edge. And so if we go to step 5 here, you see that the assets and endpoint profiles that we saw on the right in the cloud are represented as custom resources that are native comfortable things for the Kubernetes native environment. And then
mhm.
finally, as we look at the various components of Azure IT operations at the edge, these are leveraged to, for instance, connect to an OPC server and to get data from a specific asset.
Gotcha. So I have a question here, Dima. As you are describing this, and me love me some good diagramming. I one of the questions that I always think about in the context of ADR is, like, how should I think about the definition of industrial asset, right? Versus a cloud asset? How should I, as a noob for ADR, how should I think about this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the word asset, I think, in many scenarios is used quite generously, right? And every industry, every company might have a slightly different definition. And so, when it comes to this industrial asset at the edge, when we
Mhm,
talk about an asset, we're talking about something that is a kind of a logical definition of something of value on the shop floor. So, for instance, that could be a conveyor belt, it could be a robot arm. And so
mhm,
the idea is you have a bunch of data points, you have a bunch of tags, you have a bunch of events coming from that shop floor, and you need a way to organize it and map it into something that folks on the IT understand, and the folks that on the OT world understand. And so the asset becomes that common framework for defining that industrial edge in bits and pieces that kind of make sense and can be tracked and are things that you can then generate value from.
Got it. This is what we like to refer as contextualizing that data, that is coming from the. I'm loving it.
That's right.
All right.
That's right. Awesome. So let's dive in a little bit. So a very high level of what is ADR, and then we'll talk a little bit about those assets and endpoint profiles that are the foundation of this cloud to edge capability that we're talking about here. So ADR at its simplest, in the simplest form, is a resource provider of Azure resources for these assets and endpoint profiles. And so what makes ADR super interesting, as you alluded to earlier, Lior, is that it is a resource provider that enables the projection of those edge industrial assets into Azure as Azure native resources. So that means that things that before were in separate systems and various silos are now brought into Azure and can be managed in a unified registry, creating this single source of truth for whether that's for Azure services, for partners building on top, as well as for
Mhm.
customers building their own services and applications, both in the cloud and at the edge. And what you get from ADR by having your asset defined there is that now your Azure management plane that folks are already familiar with, so Azure Resource Graph, Azure Policy, and all of
Mhm.
these management constructs that are already very well defined are now also available to these industrial assets that are now in ADR. And so that means that whether you want to manage through Azure IoT Operations Experience, which we'll cover in the demo later today, or you prefer to use the REST APIs, the CLI, PowerShell, now assets are fair game. And that is a really, really powerful thing that we're bringing to the market with ADR and Azure IoT Operations.
Yeah, and definitely, when we started with Azure Arc a few years back, it was mainly around the construct of servers, which is still a very much valid use case today. One of the, if not the most popular use case for sure. But as we are expanding this offering, right, with Azure Arc, this notion of thinking of a robot arm or a boiler or whatnot, those assets that we're talking about as Azure resources, I keep saying that it's just remarkable. That thing is just a game changer. But I do want to ask you one more thing here, Dima, because as I'm looking at this slide and I'm seeing something there, you have GitOps mentioned, right? And this is a topic that is near dear to my heart. I always like to do this type of GitOps demos. It's always fun. What's the relationship between ADR and GitOps? And I think that potentially you're covering some of this stuff later, so maybe I'm a bit early here, but I'm just curious, like how should I think about this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's worth covering a little bit now, even if we cover a little bit more of it in the subsequent slides. And I think the relationship there is that what happens with assets is now that they are defined in code, in config, now that they are available in the Azure management plane as these ARM resources, that opens up the world of using Bicep or other technologies to
Mm,
essentially deploy infrastructure as code. And now it's not just your VMs, as you pointed out, it's not just your servers that are part of that flow, but your industrial assets can be included as well. And so this
mm,
means that you no longer have to have a different set of tools for your industrial edge versus your sort of IT cloud. And that convergence, we think, is really going to help accelerate the adoption of these technologies
mm.
in a lot of the customers that are interested in this solution today.
Interesting. All right.
Awesome. And then maybe one final thing to call out about this slide is that not only do we have this ARM representation at the edge and in the cloud, but we also are delivering these ARM resources to the edge and representing them as custom resources in the Kubernetes cluster. So not only does that mean that you can interact with them through the Azure management plane in the cloud, but for instance, if you're building an edge application, you can read these custom resources at the edge. And that is another place where sort of the GitOps question that you had fills in, is not now these assets are represented not just in the cloud, not just at
Mm,
the edge, but you have this common layer that's represented in both places using the tools and technologies that those folks are familiar with.
gotcha.
Awesome. So let's keep going. So if we go to the next slide, quick overview of an asset, and this will come through more through the demo, but I just wanted to call it out, right? This is a cloud managed Azure native resources enabled by Azure Arc. It works with all of the things that you're already familiar with in Azure. And it allows you to essentially define your asset through whether it's metadata like the manufacturer, name, data points that we'll see in the demo, or events such as when there's an error or an alert that is happening that you want to see in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second concept that we'll talk about before we get in a bit more detail is this endpoint profile. And so what the endpoint profile is all about is it is about managing that southbound industrial edge connectivity from the cloud. So for instance, if you have Azure IoT operations deployed, and maybe you have an OPC UA server or a couple of OPC UA servers that you're connecting to, you're able to configure the connectivity parameters, whether that's the address of that server or whether that's the certificate that you want to use to connect to that server. That information can be configured from the cloud, and ADR takes care of bringing it down to the edge and exposing it there for AIO to use. So in other words, it means that you have both the visibility and the manageability of these concepts from the familiarity of operations experiences as well as the portal.
Love it.
Awesome. So let's double click a little bit on a flow that we'll then go through in a demo. And what I want to show to you today is the idea of this asset creation flow from the cloud. So it all starts with Azure IoT Operations Experience, UX, which you'll see in just a moment. And the UX is able to use ARG, Azure Resource Graph, to get the list of the clusters that you might have in your environment. Now, once you have the list of the clusters, Azure IoT Operations Experience can target a specific cluster, a specific deployment of Azure IoT Operations with the creation of an asset. So you define your tags, your data points, your events, and then there's a bunch of magic that happens afterwards. But here in this diagram, you'll see what happens under the hood. So for one, through the ARM APIs, the asset is created in Azure Device Registry as a resource provider. ADR takes care of taking that asset and sending it down to the Kubernetes bridge so that it can be created at the edge. Once it is accepted, then the resource travels down to the edge, reaches the Arc agent tree running on the cluster, and then if it is accepted, we then create this ARM resource in the cloud that represents this asset. We get that information to the user through the UX, so they have the visibility into what's happening. And then once that happens asynchronously, the edge takes care of creation of that custom resource. And once it's successful, you're in pretty good shape. Now you've got an asset created, and then the OPC UA broker, which is on the right here, can start sending that data that it now understands as a set of data points, events, to IoTMQ, which can then travel to the cloud or stay on the edge for additional processing. And
I
then
really
just a
like
couple,
that. It really
yeah.
illustrate the relationship there, you know?
That's right. And I think what's nice about this is there are a lot of steps here, but as you'll see in the demo, it's a pretty seamless process for the user, which is something that we optimized for, given that we both have the IT persona and then the OT persona that may not know what a Kubernetes cluster is. And in some case, they may not even care. So just to wrap up the flow diagram before we move to the demo scenario, we have this provisioning that's successful at the edge, and then the operations experience UX in the cloud can get the status, get the success, and then the user can have that confirmation that everything that they've created in the cloud is also at the edge, and they get that confirmation loud and clear in the UI.
Very cool.
Awesome. So I'll set up the demo, and then we'll go through that. So in this demo, we are stepping into the shoes of a wind farm operator who has a bunch of wind turbines that they have deployed. And in their scenario, the reason they're interested in Azure IoT Operations, the reason they're interested in Azure Device Registry and the overall Arc ecosystem is that they are trying to monitor and reduce wear on costly components in these turbines. And so gearboxes is a good example of that, where if you have to replace those very often, then you run up a pretty big bill. And so what we're doing with ADR and Azure IoT Operations is they are relying on Azure as that unified management plane for all of their turbine equipment at the edge. They are able to converge both the IT persona's needs and the OT persona's needs with these tailored experiences. And then what we'll see in the demo is a more of a tactical solution to their kind of initial need is to define some of this edge connectivity info through the asset endpoint profile, and then they're going to define some assets as well through the cloud. All right.
Sounds good.
Let's jump right into the demo. So let's
Show
see
me the
here.
magic.
All right. So So here we've arrived. This is the Azure IoT Operations experience. So this is a tailor-made experience for the OT persona to be able to manage their environment. So what I'm going to do here to start is I'm going to find my cluster. So let's do that, and then we'll jump right into some of the authoring experience that we have. Okay, so I've got my cluster here. And so what I'm going to start with is, so it kind of lands me in this clean slate here. I've got a new environment set up for this demo. I've got my asset tab. I've got my asset endpoint tab. And what I'm going to start with is creating a new asset endpoint profile. And so just as a reminder from earlier today, the asset endpoint is essentially a way to define some kind of edge industrial connectivity gateway, some kind of endpoint that you would want to connect to. So let's pick a name. Let's say OPCUA server for Turbine 7. We're going to pick a URL that we got from our admin, and then we're going to press create. So just like that, the creation process begins. We'll give it a few moments, and then we will go in and create an asset that is going to use this asset endpoint profile to connect in the edge. So what's happening behind the scenes here is we've essentially creating that ARM resource, and through the Kubernetes bridge, we're also creating that Kubernetes custom resource that represents this asset endpoint profile on the cluster. Ta-da! So there we go. Create asset endpoint successful. So now we have it. We can take a quick look. We have our information here, and we see that the provisioning state has succeeded. So if you remember from the flow diagram, this essentially says that it successfully was propagated down to the edge, and we are good to go. So now we go to the asset part. So to create an asset, we go into this fairly streamlined and easy to use flow. We've got an opportunity to select an asset endpoint. So this is that OPCUA server that we had just assigned earlier. We're going to select that. We're going to give the asset a nice descriptive name. We're going to give it a nice description. And then here at the bottom, we see that there is some opportunity to add some properties. So in other words, you've created your asset, but you probably have a lot of assets. And so you want to be able to store some metadata about them. So for this example, I'm going to maybe post a link to the documentation for this asset. And then let's also add a hardware revision. And then I'm going to clear out these other ones that we aren't using for this demo. And then we can press next. But maybe before we do that, I just wanted to show that in the event that you have a custom property that is very unique to your use case or to your business, you can actually take this custom property UX and assign something that's entirely custom, that's bespoke, that maybe isn't something that would come out of the box. All right, so now we have gotten to the tag addition screen. So this is where you would define, okay, you've got this wind turbine. What information does it provide? And so you can add tags manually, which is useful, but in many scenarios, we think folks are going to have them in a CSV file or some other format. And so in order to expedite the flow, we'll take a predefined CSV file and we'll import a bunch of tags with one click. So then if you want to take a look here, we've got some gearbox vibration telemetry, we've got some tower sway information, we've got some ambient temperature and a power output. So a bunch of interesting telemetry that this particular wind farm operator wants to get.
And just to provide some context here, and keep me honest here, Dima, these tags are extremely important in the context of what information is getting sent to the OPC server, right? In that case, right, that endpoint that is pointing to that OPC server, which is extremely important, especially, coming back to what you mentioned, that you usually have like large environments, right? So when you want to create that standardization around the messaging bus that is transferring the right data, this is where those tags are becoming extremely helpful, right?
Exactly. No, that's spot on. And I think what is often difficult in these industrial environments is that you have a lot of institutional knowledge where somebody knows these tag names and somebody doesn't. and oftentimes you're kind of hunting for the right person to talk to. And so what
Yeah.
what this does is you're bringing this information into the cloud, and then this really democratizes the access to this information so that you no longer have to find the right local team that has this information, and you can essentially configure this once and then
Yeah.
reliably share this data with your data
I
analyst, with
like
your
it.
data scientist, and any other teams that are looking to optimize your business. So we'll continue with the demo. So we've got a similar process for events. So the first one was about more of a telemetry set of information. An event might be something like a system error or a gearbox overheat. So in other words, some kind of an alert or a signal that an asset may generate. And so now this defines it. And as Lior, you pointed out earlier, this is that key glue between the OPC UA broker and the rest of the data pipeline that we have as part of Azure IT operations. Okay, so let's continue. We've got a nice overview screen that just helps us make sure that we've entered all of the data correctly. And then I will press create. So,
and it's really, as we're looking at the create asset, like it's really interesting to see how eventually, and this pops really nicely in the summary page, how you basically created some sort of a profile for a specific asset, and the combination of the tags, the custom events, and also the metadata that you had there at the beginning, like this really, like you mentioned, I like that word, democratize, like that asset specifically. It creates an identity for something that before that was just kind of floating in the industrial environment of the user, right? So that really gives it a nice spin.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the idea is that once these assets are defined, this really enables the rest of the business to really engage very deeply with the data that's coming from these assets. And so
I like it.
to that end, right, we've got our wind turbine 7, so that was successfully created. We can click into it. We can see that it's assigned to that endpoint profile that we started our demo with. And then maybe to close off, I'll kind of switch over to the Azure portal and to show you that, hey, all of this that was created in an operations team centric approach, right? So they're not aware of Azure portal necessarily. They're not really familiar with Kubernetes, but the IT persona are. And it is important for IT to have the visibility into all of the resources that are being created so that you don't have an IT silo and an OT silo. So what you're seeing here is that those two resources that we created, the endpoint profile as well as the wind turbine itself as an asset, they're both Azure resources, right? So you can drill into the wind turbine, for example. You can see that it's part of a resource group. It's assigned to a Kubernetes cluster. It works and looks just like an Azure resource. However, we've also enabled those OT persona to operate in this environment without having to understand all of the nitty gritty of the technology that is under the hood.
Yeah.
And then finally, one thing that maybe is worth showing, so for the sort of the interest in GitOps and interest in just generally the ability to define a lot of these assets as Azure resources, worth calling out that all of the information that we presented to the operator UX earlier, right? So the name, the tie-in with the endpoint profile, even the documentation URI, that's all part of this asset definition here. And then one thing that's worth calling out for folks that are familiar with Arc and how Arc works, we have this extended location here, which is essentially the glue that tells this resource that it's part of an edge location. And so to that end, this is the Dima test cluster that we have set up for this demo. And so this is what says that this asset will be brought down by the Kubernetes bridge to the edge and then be exposed there as a custom resource for use in AIO as well as any customer built applications.
Beautiful. I'm loving it. Dima, thank you so much for this awesome demo. Really. I mean, I think that the light bulb moment here, besides the fact that when you have like an OT environment, right, that we talked about this, like you create the asset, you create some sort of an identity to that asset, right? Almost like personality. But the light bulb moment here, and this is where Arc fits in, right, is the moment that you click refresh and then you see this in the portal, just like that. And, who would have thought that you have, a wind turbine, in the portal. So that's kind of cool to see. Dima, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. It was awesome. Thank you so much
Yeah,
for that.
thanks, Lior. Thanks for having me.
And for the Jumpstart viewers, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe. More awesome content is coming, and we're going to see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.